Jag vill bykta mig så uppriktigt jag kan. Men mitt hjärta är tomt och tomheten är en spegel vänd mot mitt eget ansikte. Genom min likgiltighet för människorna har jag ställts utanför deras...
You already know you're complicit. You know it in your bones, in the specific gravity of guilt you carry through ordinary days. The phone you're holding was assembled by hands you'll never shake. The coffee cooling beside you carries the sweat of farmers whose names you'll never learn. You are trying to be good in a world that makes goodness impossible. And the exhaustion of this trying is the water you swim in, so constant you barely notice you're drowning. George Orwell understood this drowning, not because he solved it, but because he felt it so acutely that he spent his entire life gasping for air, writing his way towards some kind of moral clarity that always remained just beyond reach. When he described what he called ordinary people pursuing common decency, he wasn't offering a solution. He was naming the problem. Because decency, in Orwell's world and in ours, isn't common at all. It's the rarest and most costly thing a human being can attempt. This is about the terrible paradox that sits at the center of moral consciousness, the one Orwell circled in every book he wrote, but never quite named directly. The paradox that the moment you become capable of seeing injustice clearly enough to fight it, you also become capable of seeing your own inescapable complicity within it. Albert Camus, writing in the ruins of World War II, gave us the image of Sisyphus pushing his boulder up the mountain, watching it roll back down, pushing again. Camus insisted we must imagine Sisyphus happy, because the struggle itself becomes the meaning. But what Orwell understood, what haunted him until tuberculosis finally won, was something more specific and more cutting. The absurdity isn't just that we die, it's that we know better and still can't do better. We see the cage and remain trapped. We understand the lie and still mouth its words. We hate the system and wake up every morning serving it. Orwell was born into this contradiction, into what he would later describe as the lower upper middle class. A phrase that sounds like a joke until you sit with it. His mother carried herself with the bearing of wealth she no longer possessed. His father managed the opium trade in British India. They had the snobbery of the privileged and the anxiety of the impoverished, that particular kind of social vertigo that comes from knowing exactly where you're supposed to stand in the hierarchy while feeling the ground crumble beneath you. This wasn't biographical trivia. This was the formation of a particular kind of sight, the ability to see both sides of every class barrier because he straddled them all. When he was sent to boarding school on scholarship, surrounded by boys whose families had the kind of money his family pretended to have, he learned to perform belonging while feeling the constant hum of fraudulence beneath his skin. He learned that merit was real, but class was realer, that your ability mattered far less than your surname, that the game was rigged long before you arrived to play it. But the scholarship gave him fluency in the language of power, without the comfort of believing in it. He could speak like them, think like them, understand their logic from the inside. And this double consciousness, this ability to inhabit two worlds while belonging fully to neither, became the source of everything he would later write. Because to fight a system, you must first understand it, and to understand it, you often must be complicit within it. This is the first turn of the paradox. He went to Eton, that factory, for producing the men who would run the British Empire. He could see what it was for. He was being trained to manage, to administer, to maintain, to produce a particular kind of human being, one who could govern others without questioning the right to govern, one who could extract resources from distant lands without losing sleep, one who could watch suffering and call it civilization. Orwell didn't go to university. Instead, he joined the Indian Imperial Police and requested Burma. He was 19 years old. He wanted to see the empire from the inside, to understand what it actually meant to be the boot. And he saw. For 5 years, he wore the uniform, carried the rifle, gave the orders. He upheld laws he didn't believe in. He participated in a system of oppression so total that it had become invisible to most of its operators. Just the natural order of things, the way the world worked. There's an essay he wrote years later called Shooting an Elephant, and it remains one of the most honest pieces ever written about the psychology of power. He describes being called to deal with an elephant that had gone wild in a Burmese market. He arrives to find the elephant calm again, no longer a threat. He knows he doesn't need to shoot it, but there's a crowd of Burmese people gathered, 2,000 faces watching him, waiting to see what the representative of British authority will do. And he realizes he has to shoot the elephant, not because it's dangerous, but because the crowd expects it. Because to not shoot would be to appear weak, to reveal that the power he represents is just performance. So he shoots, again and again, watching the animal die slowly, horribly, while the crowd cheers, and he feels something inside himself die with it. This is what he learned in Burma. That evil isn't always a choice made by evil people. Sometimes it's a choice made by ordinary people trapped in a system that punishes decency and rewards cruelty. That you can know something is wrong and still do it, because the alternative is to break the machinery you're part of. He learned that complicity isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's simply survival within structures we didn't design but can't escape. After 5 years, he resigned. His family was horrified, but he couldn't be the boot anymore, couldn't enforce a system he had come to see as fundamentally obscene. So he went to Paris, then London, and worked the kind of jobs that people with Eton educations aren't supposed to work. He washed dishes, he worked in a second-hand bookshop, he lived in cheap boarding houses. He knew what it meant to be cold, hungry, uncertain. Orwell wasn't slumming. He had genuinely extracted himself from the class he was born into, without being accepted into the working class he now inhabited. He existed in the gaps, belonging nowhere. And this position gave him the kind of sight that only comes from being permanently displaced. He could see the working class without romanticizing them. He could see the intellectual class without deference. During these years, he started writing. Burmese Days, so critical of British imperialism that it couldn't be published in England first. A Clergyman's Daughter, about a woman losing her faith in a world that offers no alternatives. Keep the Aspidistra Flying, about a man who discovers that poverty doesn't make you noble. It just makes you poor. These books were building towards something. Orwell was developing his signature insight that most political writing was dishonest, not because writers lied deliberately, but because they couldn't see their own positions within the systems they described. He was learning to write with what he would call intellectual honesty, the willingness to follow an argument wherever it led, even if it contradicted everything he wanted to believe. But this honesty was still mostly theoretical, confined to the page. Observations about other people's compromises. He hadn't yet been tested in the way that separates conviction from performance, the way that reveals whether you'll maintain your principles when maintaining them might cost you everything. Then, in 1936, Spain erupted. The Spanish Civil War wasn't just another conflict in the newspapers. It was the future declaring itself, the ideological battle of the century condensed into one country, democracy and fascism locked in combat that would determine what the next decades would look like. And for Orwell, still working in his bookshop, still writing his moderately successful novels, still trying to figure out what it meant to be decent in an indecent world. Spain represented something he couldn't ignore. A choice. Maybe the only real choice he would ever face. He could stay safe, write about injustice from a comfortable distance, maintain his intellectual honesty without risking anything more than his reputation. Or he could go. Not as an observer, not as a journalist, but as someone willing to fight for what he claimed to believe. Common decency, he would say later, when asked why he went. Just that. The basic principle that ordinary people deserve to live without being crushed by tyranny. And if you believe that, truly believe it, then at some point you have to be willing to put your body where your beliefs are. So he went. And what he found in Spain would destroy every comfortable illusion he still carried, would show him something about the nature of political movements and human psychology that he would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate. Spain would teach him that the threat to freedom doesn't just come from the obvious enemies, the ones wearing the wrong uniforms and speaking the wrong slogans. It comes from everywhere, including from inside the movements that claim to be fighting for liberation. But that education, that terrible gift of clarity, came at a cost he couldn't have anticipated. Because there's a difference between understanding complicity intellectually, as an abstract concept you can write about, and experiencing it viscerally, watching it unfold in real time, seeing how easily truth becomes expendable when power is at stake. Spain would show him that difference. And once he saw it, once he understood it, not as theory, but as lived reality, there would be no going back to the comfort of simple narratives or easy answers. You are heir to Orwell's unfinished work, to his unanswered questions. You wake up every day already embedded in systems you didn't choose, already complicit in harm you can't prevent, already aware that trying to be good might be futile, but not trying feels like surrender. This is the inheritance. The knowledge that decency is rare, costly, and maybe impossible, but also the knowledge that the alternative, the refusal to even try, is a kind of death. The terrible paradox of being a good person is that awareness doesn't simplify your choices. It complicates them. It shows you that every action has consequences you can't control, that every stance has compromises you can't avoid, that every attempt to do good exists within systems designed to corrupt those attempts. And yet there's something in the trying itself, in the refusal to accept that corruption is inevitable, in the stubborn insistence on decency even when decency seems impossible. That might be the only honest response we have. Orwell learned this, not as an abstract principle, but as lived experience, as wounds both physical and psychological, as betrayals both witnessed and endured. And what he learned would transform him from another clever writer into something more dangerous and more necessary, someone who had seen clearly enough to never be comfortable again, but who couldn't look away, couldn't stop trying to show others what he'd seen, couldn't surrender to the ease of either cynicism or blind faith. The next part of this story is about how he learned to see, not the gradual process of awareness, but the violent rupture of understanding, the moment when everything he thought he knew revealed itself as insufficient, about how Burma prepared him, but Spain broke him open, about how witnessing truth become optional in real time changed not just what he believed, but how he believed. Not just his politics, but his entire relationship to certainty itself. About how the moment you truly see clearly, you can never unsee. And how that seeing, that terrible gift of clarity, becomes both burden and compass, both wound and weapon, both the thing that destroys your peace and the only thing that makes peace worth having. Some wounds never close. They heal over on the surface while remaining raw underneath, tender places that ache when pressure is applied, reminders of what broke you and can break you again. Orwell carried 2 such wounds. Burma gave him the first, a slow accumulation of moral injury spread across 5 years of enforcing laws he despised, of watching himself become the mechanism of oppression he would later spend his life opposing. That wound taught him complicity, showed him how ordinary people become instruments of evil through small daily choices rather than dramatic moral failures. Spain gave him the second wound, and this one nearly killed him in more ways than one. The sniper's bullet that tore through his throat in 1937 was the least of it. Physical damage heals, or it doesn't, but either way, the body's response is straightforward. The other injury, the one inflicted not by fascists, but by his own supposed allies, that wound remained open for the rest of his short life. He enlisted immediately, joining a militia affiliated with a small Marxist party called the PAOM. They sent him to the Aragon front, where the war was mostly cold, boredom, and terrible food, punctuated by occasional moments of terror. And then something happened. A fascist sniper's bullet entered his throat and exited near his spine, missing the carotid artery by millimeters. He should have died. He didn't. He lost his voice for weeks, but he survived. That physical wound healed. The other wound, the one that came after, never did. When he returned to Barcelona in May 1937, the revolution had turned on itself. The Communist Party, backed by Soviet advisors and weapons, had decided that winning the war required eliminating anyone who might threaten their control afterward. The POUM, the anarchists, anyone who represented a different vision of what the revolution should be, they were all being labelled as fascist agents, traitors, enemies of the people. Orwell's friends were disappearing. People he'd fought beside in the trenches were being arrested in the night, taken to secret prisons, some of them never seen again. And the newspapers, the foreign press, the intellectuals back in London and Paris who claimed to care about truth and justice, they were printing exactly what the Communist Party told them to print. Orwell couldn't believe it at first. He would read accounts of battles he'd actually been present for, and the accounts bore no relationship to what had happened. History was being written in real time, and it was being written as fiction. This wasn't just lying. Lying implies someone knows the truth and chooses to obscure it. This was something more fundamental and more terrifying. This was the substitution of ideology for reality. The decision that what should be true matters more than what is true. And once you make that substitution, once you decide that the ends justify not just violent means, but the complete abandonment of factual accuracy, then anything becomes possible. Any atrocity can be justified. Any victim can be reframed as a perpetrator. Any evidence can be dismissed as enemy propaganda. Orwell barely escaped Spain with his life. The Communist Party had added his name to the list of people to be arrested, and if they'd caught him, he would have disappeared like his friends. He and his wife fled across the border with nothing, knowing they could never return. He came back to England changed. Not just disillusioned, though he was that. Something more fundamental had broken in him, or maybe broken open. He had gone to Spain, believing that the fight against fascism was straightforward, that if you opposed tyranny, you were on the right side. And what he discovered was that his own team, the people supposedly fighting for freedom and justice, were capable of their own totalitarianism, their own manipulation of truth, their own cruelty toward anyone who questioned the official narrative. This is where Camus becomes essential to understanding what Orwell experienced. Camus, writing a few years later in The Rebel, described how every revolution carries within it the seeds of its own betrayal. The revolutionary begins by demanding justice for the oppressed, but ends by establishing a new form of oppression, because the revolutionary believes they possess the truth, and anyone who opposes the truth must be eliminated. The rebel, Camus argued, must refuse this logic. The rebel says no to oppression, but also says no to becoming the oppressor. The rebel recognizes that the moment you claim to possess absolute truth, you become capable of absolute evil in its name. Orwell had become that kind of rebel, not because he chose to, but because Spain left him no choice. He couldn't join the communists because he'd seen what they did to their own allies. He couldn't join the anti-communists because many of them were fascist sympathizers. He couldn't claim political neutrality because fascism had to be opposed. He was trapped in a position of seeing all sides clearly and finding all sides compromised, forced to choose between imperfect options while refusing to pretend the imperfections didn't exist. This is the education in seeing. It's not just learning what's wrong with the world. It's learning that everyone who claims to be fixing what's wrong is also, in some way, making it worse. It's learning that your own side lies, that your own team commits atrocities, that the people who speak your language of justice are capable of injustice. It's learning that there is no pure position, no uncompromised stance, no way to fight evil without using tools that corrupt you in the process. And here's what makes this education so violent, so difficult to survive. Once you see this, you can't go back to the comfort of simple narratives. You can't divide the world into good people and bad people anymore. You can't believe that if your side just wins, everything will be okay. You're forced to live in a permanent state of critical awareness, constantly evaluating not just your enemies, but your allies. Not just the opposition, but your own movement. Not just the lies they tell, but the lies you tell yourself. This is exhausting. This is why most people, even good people, even people who care deeply about justice, resist this kind of seeing. Because it leaves you nowhere to stand, no team to join completely, no ideology to surrender to, no authority to trust without question. Orwell tried to write about what he'd witnessed. He wrote Homage to Catalonia, his account of the Spanish Civil War, attempting to document what actually happened rather than what various political factions wanted people to believe had happened. Left-wing publishers rejected it. The truth was too complicated, too uncomfortable, too likely to complicate the simple narrative of heroes versus villains. In rejecting his honesty, they demonstrated exactly what he was trying to warn against. Spain taught him that totalitarianism isn't only imposed by obvious dictators. It's also a psychological tendency, a willingness to prioritize what you want to be true over what actually is true. A habit of mind that exists in everyone, but flourishes especially in those convinced they're fighting for justice. When you believe your cause is righteous, justifying small deceptions, small manipulations, small acts of silencing becomes almost automatic. You're doing it for the greater good, after all. Yet Orwell clung to the belief that facts existed independent of political convenience, that some version of truth persisted beneath the competing narratives. Not that any person could fully grasp that truth, not that his own perception was somehow privileged or complete, but that reality itself remained stubbornly real, regardless of what anyone claimed about it. Without some shared commitment to distinguishing what happened from what we wish had happened, power becomes the only arbiter, and whoever controls the narrative controls everything. He spent the rest of his life trying to articulate this position, knowing most wouldn't listen, knowing even allies would reject him for refusing to lie in service of causes he believed in. But he kept trying, kept writing, kept insisting on a kind of intellectual honesty that made him perpetually uncomfortable to be around. Not because he had all the answers, but because he refused to pretend certainty where he felt doubt. refused to accept convenient lies, even when the truth was messier and less useful. You've had your own education in seeing, even if it didn't involve bullets or betrayal. You've watched narratives get constructed, watched how facts get selected or ignored depending on what story needs telling. You've seen people you respect justify actions they would condemn if performed by opponents. The pressure to accept official versions, to avoid inconvenient questions, to remain loyal even when loyalty requires ignoring what you witness directly. Orwell's education becomes yours the moment you recognize these patterns. The violence of clarity, the burden of perceiving what others refuse to acknowledge or genuinely cannot see. Once this seeing happens, it alters your relationship to everything: politics, truth, your own certainty about what's right. The comfort of believing your side is different, your cause pure, your movement exempt from the corruptions that plagued others. All of that dissolves under scrutiny. What makes this education difficult to survive is how it forces you to hold everything at critical distance. You must question not just enemies, but allies. Evaluate not just opposition, but your own movement. Recognize not just their lies, but the ones you tell yourself. This perpetual vigilance exhausts you, even as it protects you from manipulation. Orwell came back from Spain with vigilance hardened into armor. He had learned to recognize patterns, how language gets weaponized, how history gets rewritten, how movements betray their stated principles while claiming perfect consistency. He developed what he would later describe as a power of facing unpleasant facts, a willingness to acknowledge truths that contradicted his preferences and desires. But vigilance, once developed, becomes difficult to control or contain. The habit of questioning others' certainties can become its own form of certainty. The refusal to accept comfortable lies can calcify into an inability to tolerate ambiguity. The commitment to intellectual honesty, pushed far enough, can become as rigid and unforgiving as the ideologies it opposes. Orwell faced a choice that everyone who learns to see faces eventually. Once you've been betrayed by your ideals, once you've watched your own side prove itself capable of the same corruptions you opposed, what do you do with that knowledge? You can't go back to naive belief. You can't unsee what you've seen. But moving forward means deciding what to do with your hard-won clarity. One option is cynicism, declaring all causes equally corrupt, all movements equally doomed, all idealism equally naive. Another option is more subtle and more seductive, becoming so committed to truth, so vigilant against manipulation, so determined never to be fooled again, that your clarity itself becomes a kind of absolutism. Your refusal to accept lies transforms into an inability to tolerate complexity. Your awareness of how others deceive themselves makes you increasingly certain that you alone see clearly, while everyone else remains deluded. Orwell would struggle with this tension for the rest of his life. Not the obvious struggle between truth and lies, but the more difficult one between commitment to truth and the tyranny that commitment can breed, between intellectual honesty and intellectual rigidity, between seeing clearly and believing that clarity makes you immune to the very delusions you identify in others. Because Spain taught him about others, about how movements betray their ideals, and truth becomes expendable when power is at stake. But the harder lesson, the one that would haunt his final years, was understanding how those same forces operated within himself, how his own pursuit of truth could become its own form of tyranny, how his own clarity could create new forms of blindness, how the guardian of truth can become a tyrant of truth, wielding honesty like a weapon against anyone who questions or doubts. The next part explores that internal struggle, the war between maintaining principles and recognizing that principles, pushed to their absolute limit, become indistinguishable from the dogmas they oppose. About how the person who learned to see most clearly must confront the possibility that even clarity has its shadow side, that even the commitment to fighting manipulation can itself become manipulative, that even the refusal to surrender can become its own form of fundamentalism. If everyone is subject to delusion, if every perspective is partial and incomplete, if all certainty is potentially dangerous, then how do you fight for truth without becoming a fundamentalist of truth? How do you maintain intellectual honesty without turning that honesty into a new ideology, as rigid and unforgiving as the ones you oppose? How do you avoid becoming the very thing you set out to fight? Orwell never fully answered these questions, but in his struggle with them, in his willingness to turn his critical eye on his own certainties, he showed us something crucial, that the danger of being right isn't that you're wrong. It's that being right, feeling the righteousness of your position, can make you dangerous in ways you fail to recognize, precisely because you're so convinced of your correctness. Being right becomes addictive, not just intellectually satisfying, but physiologically rewarding, a neurochemical rush that reinforces itself with each validation. The more correct you prove to be, the more convinced you become of your capacity to see what others miss, the more potent that reward becomes. Eventually, you're not seeking truth anymore. You're seeking the feeling of being right, and those are dangerously different pursuits. Orwell returned from Spain righteously angry, and he had earned that anger. He'd been shot, hunted by supposed allies, forced to watch intellectuals and journalists lie with impunity about events he'd witnessed firsthand. His anger was justified. His clarity was real. The question was what he would do with that clarity, how he would wield it, whether he would use it as a tool for understanding or as a weapon for judgment. In his essays after 1937, a subtle shift becomes apparent. The man who had written with such nuanced self-examination about his own complicity in Burma, who had shown such awareness of his own contradictions and limitations, began writing with increasing harshness about others. He developed categories, taxonomies of dishonesty, not just the obvious liars, but worse, the people who lied to themselves, who couldn't see their own hypocrisy, because ideology had colonized their capacity for self-reflection. Often he was correct in his observations, when he noted that intellectuals were particularly susceptible to totalitarian thinking, because they lived in abstractions rather than concrete realities. He identified something genuine. When he argued that political writing had become an exercise in defending indefensible positions through euphemism and obfuscation, he was right. When he warned that language was being degraded, words losing their meanings and becoming instruments of manipulation, he saw something real and dangerous. But correctness about others' self-deceptions didn't immunize him against his own. It may have made him more vulnerable, because he believed his education in seeing had inoculated him against delusion. He had been to Burma, he had been to Spain, he had seen through lies when others swallowed them. Surely that meant he could trust his own perceptions, his own judgments, his own clarity about who was honest and who was compromised. Here lies the seduction that waits for anyone who experiences a moment of awakening. You see through one illusion and suddenly believe you can see through all illusions. You recognize one form of manipulation and convince yourself you're immune to all manipulation. You understand how others are fooled and forget that understanding the mechanism of fooling doesn't prevent you from being fooled. It just means you'll be fooled differently in ways less obvious to you, precisely because you've convinced yourself you've transcended the need for such vigilance about your own thinking. Camus understood this trap. In The Rebel, he warned that revolutionaries who claim to possess truth necessarily become murderers, not from cruelty, but from logic. If you know what's right, if you can see what others can't, if you understand the path to justice while others remain blind, then their resistance isn't merely wrong, but dangerous. It threatens not just your goals, but truth itself. And in service of truth, in defense of what you know to be correct, almost anything becomes justifiable. Orwell saw this pattern in Stalin, in the Inquisition, in every ideological movement that started with liberation and ended with purges. He analyzed it brilliantly, dissected it with surgical precision, yet recognizing the pattern in historical movements differs vastly from recognizing it in your own thinking, your own certainties, your own conviction that you perceive clearly while others remain deluded. Consider how he thought about truth itself. For Orwell, the existence of objective truth wasn't just a philosophical position. It was a moral necessity. Without it, without some shared agreement about what actually happened, totalitarianism becomes inevitable. If there's no truth beyond what the party says is true, then the party can make you believe anything, can make you doubt your own memories, your own perceptions, your own sanity. Truth becomes the last defense against total domination. But here's the paradox. The more desperately you need truth to be objective, the more you need reality to be solid and unchanging. The less able you become to recognize that human beings experience truth differently based on their contexts, their histories, their positions in the world. A Burmese person living under British occupation experienced British imperialism very differently than Orwell did, even though they both experienced the same system. Which experience is the objective truth? Both are real. Both are valid. Both are true from the perspective of the person living them. This is what philosophers call the problem of perspective, and it's what makes moral certainty so dangerous. Because once you convince yourself that you see reality clearly while others are deluded, once you decide that your truth is the truth, and everyone else is either lying or mistaken, you've already started down the path that leads to Room 101. You've already begun the process of dividing the world into the enlightened and the blind, the truth-tellers and the liars, the righteous and the corrupt. And from there, it's a shorter distance than you think to justifying violence against those who refuse to see what you see, who refuse to accept what you know to be true. Orwell would write about this very dynamic in 1984, but in his personal life, in his essays and his arguments and his relationships, you can see him struggling with it. He could be remarkably generous and remarkably harsh, sometimes in the same piece of writing. He would defend nuance and then turn around and make sweeping declarations. He would warn against the danger of political orthodoxy while maintaining his own orthodoxies about language, about honesty, about what it meant to think clearly. There's a list that came to light after his death, a list he'd made of people he considered crypto-communists or fellow travelers, people whose sympathies he believed made them unreliable, potentially dangerous. Some of the entries are shockingly petty. He questioned people's loyalty based on who they were friends with, what they'd written, even their sexuality. The man who'd written so powerfully about the danger of thought police had created his own little catalogue of suspected thought crime. This doesn't invalidate everything Orwell wrote, but it reveals the central tension he never fully resolved. How do you fight for truth without becoming tyrannical about truth? How do you maintain moral clarity without turning that clarity into a weapon? How do you oppose totalitarianism without adopting the totalitarian certainty that you alone see clearly? These questions aren't abstract. You're living them right now. Every time you're convinced you're right and they're wrong, every time you can't understand how someone could possibly believe what they believe, every time you're tempted to write someone off as brainwashed or stupid or evil because they don't see what seems obvious to you, you're facing Orwell's dilemma. You're experiencing the seduction of clarity, the comfort of certainty, the ease of dividing the world into those who get it and those who don't. And the terrible thing is that sometimes you are right. Sometimes the other side is lying. Sometimes people are brainwashed. Sometimes clarity is exactly what's needed. The problem is that this is also exactly what everyone else thinks. The communist who condemned Orwell as a traitor believed they were seeing clearly. The fascists shooting at him in Spain believed they were defending truth. Every tyrant in history believed they were the hero of their own story, the one person willing to do what was necessary, to see what others couldn't see, to act when others were paralyzed by doubt. So how do you tell the difference? How do you know when your clarity is genuine insight and when it's just another form of blindness, a new ideology replacing the old one, a new certainty that will eventually betray you the way your previous certainties did? Orwell's answer, implied but never fully articulated, was intellectual honesty, the willingness to question your own conclusions, to entertain possibilities you find uncomfortable, to acknowledge when you're wrong, to resist the temptation to twist facts to fit your preferred narrative. But intellectual honesty is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance, constant self-examination, constant willingness to be uncertain about things you desperately want to be certain about. Most people can't sustain it. Most people eventually surrender to some ideology, some authority, some simplifying narrative that lets them stop thinking so hard about everything. And perhaps that's why Orwell became so focused on language. Language was the mechanism through which this surrender happened. If you could control language, if you could make certain thoughts literally unthinkable by eliminating the words needed to express them, then you could control what people believed without them even realizing they were being controlled. They would think they were thinking freely while actually operating within boundaries someone else had drawn for them. This insight would become the foundation of 1984, but it also represented a kind of despair. Because if language shapes thought, and if language can be controlled, then perhaps resistance is futile. Perhaps the tyrants will always win because they understand something fundamental about human psychology that the rest of us want to deny. That most people don't want freedom, don't want to think for themselves, don't want the burden of intellectual honesty. They want certainty, belonging, purpose, something to believe in that's bigger than themselves. And tyranny, dressed in the language of righteousness, offers exactly that. This is the dark conclusion that clarity threatens. Once you see how easily people are manipulated, how readily they surrender their capacity for independent thought, how eagerly they embrace lies that flatter their prejudices, it becomes very difficult to maintain faith in democracy, in ordinary people, in the very concept of common decency that drove Orwell to Spain in the first place. If people are this easily fooled, if truth matters so little compared to tribal loyalty and emotional comfort, then perhaps the enlightened few, the ones who can see clearly, have a duty to impose their vision for everyone's own good. Perhaps tyranny of the clear-sighted is preferable to chaos of the deluded. This is how revolutionaries become dictators. This is how movements for liberation become movements for control. This is how fighting monsters turns you into a monster, not through obvious corruption, not through greed or ambition, but through the sincere belief that you see something others don't. that you understand something they can't grasp, that your clarity gives you not just insight, but authority, not just knowledge, but the right to impose that knowledge on those too blind to see it themselves. Orwell recognized this pattern in others. He could see it in the Soviet Union, where the vanguard of the proletariat had become a new ruling class. He could see it in the Catholic Church, where the path to salvation had become a mechanism of control. He could see it in every ideology that claimed to liberate while actually dominating. But recognizing it in yourself is infinitely harder, because from the inside, your certainty feels like clarity. Your convictions feel like truth. Your willingness to fight feels like courage, rather than the first step toward becoming what you claim to oppose. And so Orwell kept writing, kept trying to warn people, kept pushing against the tide even as he felt himself being pulled under by the very currents he was describing. He would write one more book, a dystopian nightmare so powerful it would echo across decades, showing us exactly what happens when the tyranny of clarity becomes absolute, when those who claim to see most clearly gain complete power, when the gap between what the enlightened believe and what the masses think becomes so vast that only total control can bridge it. But before we get to that nightmare, we need to understand how the pattern plays out, not just in individuals, but in movements. Not just in Orwell, but in every revolution that promised freedom and delivered something very different. We need to see how the animal farm operates, how the pigs who start as liberators end as oppressors, how the cycle repeats with such predictability that perhaps it's not a flaw in specific ideologies, but something fundamental about what happens when human beings organize themselves around absolute truths and righteous causes. That's what comes next. The mechanism of betrayal. The architecture of revolution's failure. The terrible inevitability of good intentions becoming instruments of tyranny. Revolutions eat their children. This isn't metaphor or hyperbole. It's pattern, documented across centuries, observable in movements large and small. The French Revolution devoured Danton and Robespierre. The Russian Revolution consumed Trotsky and countless old Bolsheviks. The Spanish Republicans turned on each other while fascism waited at the gates. Orwell watched this happen in real time, and when he sat down to write Animal Farm in 1943, dying from tuberculosis and racing against his own mortality, he wasn't creating allegory, he was documenting psychology. The novella begins with animals suffering under human tyranny. Old Major, a prize boar, delivers a speech about animal liberation that ignites revolutionary fervor. He dies shortly after, but his vision persists. The animals rebel, drive out the farmer, rename the property Animal Farm, and establish 7 commandments of animalism. The final commandment reads, "All animals are equal." For a moment, it works. The harvest is successful. The animals govern themselves. They have transformed possibility into reality, turned oppression into liberation. This is the honeymoon period of every revolution, when the old order has fallen, but the new order hasn't yet revealed what it will become. When everyone believes the future will be different because they've made it different through collective will and shared sacrifice. Then the pigs begin to consolidate power, not through obvious tyranny at first, but through small adjustments. They need the milk and apples for their health, you understand. They're doing the mental labor of leadership and require proper nutrition. The other animals, still drunk on liberation, accept this explanation. It seems reasonable. Someone has to lead. Someone has to make decisions. Why not those who can read and write, who understand the complexities the simple animals cannot grasp? 2 pigs emerge as leaders. Snowball, brilliant and idealistic, wants to build a windmill that will give the animals easier lives. Napoleon, cunning and ruthless, opposes the windmill initially. The animals debate. This is democracy in action, multiple voices, contested visions of the future. Then Napoleon unleashes dogs he's been secretly training, and they chase Snowball off the farm. Napoleon declares Snowball was always a traitor, always working for the humans, always planning to sabotage the revolution from within. The animals know this isn't true. They remember Snowball fighting bravely in the rebellion. They remember his speeches, his plans, his commitment. But Napoleon controls the narrative now, and with dogs at his side, who will argue? The pigs begin rewriting history. The Battle of the Cowshed, where Snowball showed courage, becomes a story of his cowardice and treachery. Memories that contradict the official version become thought crimes, dangerous not just to express, but to hold. The commandments change, slowly, almost imperceptibly. No animal shall sleep in a bed becomes no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets. No animal shall drink alcohol becomes no animal shall drink alcohol to excess. The animals sense something wrong, but can't articulate what. They remember the commandments differently, but the words on the wall say otherwise. And the pigs have Squealer, the propaganda minister, who can explain why their memories are faulty, why what seems like betrayal is actually consistency, why their confusion is their own failure to understand rather than the pig's failure to maintain principles. Boxer, the cart horse, represents the true believer. He's strong, dedicated, works harder than anyone. His two maxims are, "I will work harder," and Napoleon is always right. When things go wrong, when evidence mounts that the pigs are becoming what they overthrew, Boxer doesn't question. He works harder. He trusts more completely. He assumes his own understanding is insufficient, rather than that his leaders might be corrupt. And when his body finally breaks from overwork, when he can no longer serve, Napoleon sells him to the knacker for glue, while telling the other animals he died peacefully at a hospital. By the novella's end, the pigs walk on two legs. They wear clothes. They sleep in the farmhouse. They drink whiskey. They trade with humans. And the final commandment, the one that promised equality, now reads, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." The pigs have become indistinguishable from the humans they overthrew. The revolution has completed its arc from liberation to new oppression, wearing the same language of justice that justified the original rebellion. Orwell wrote this as satire of Stalinism, yes, but he understood something deeper and more disturbing. The pattern wasn't specific to Soviet communism. It was intrinsic to revolutionary movements operating on certain premises, namely that some people possess truth and others don't, that the enlightened have the right to guide the unenlightened, that temporary measures justified by emergency will become permanent features once power tastes its own addictiveness. Watch how it happens inside you, not in political movements you observe from distance, but in your own psychology when you believe you're fighting for something righteous. Notice how quickly the other side becomes not just wrong, but evil. How swiftly disagreement transforms into betrayal. How naturally you start justifying tactics you would have condemned months earlier. Because now you understand what's really at stake. Now you see clearly what others refuse to acknowledge. You start by opposing injustice. You end by becoming the injustice in different form. Not because you're uniquely corrupt or unusually weak, but because this is what happens when human beings organize around absolute truths and righteous causes, without building in mechanisms for doubt, dissent, and self-correction. The pigs don't think they're betraying the revolution. They believe they're protecting it. The decisions that corrupt them feel like necessary adaptations to circumstances beyond their control. The humans won't trade with them unless they compromise certain principles. The farm won't survive unless someone makes hard choices the simple animals can't understand. Each step away from the original vision feels justified in the moment. Each commandment change seems like a reasonable clarification rather than a fundamental betrayal. And the other animals, the boxers of every movement, enable this through their devotion. They want to believe. They need to believe that their leaders are different, that their movement won't make the old mistakes, that their sacrifices serve a purpose beyond perpetuating new forms of the same old tyranny. So they accept explanations that don't quite explain. They ignore evidence that contradicts their faith. They attack anyone who questions the narrative, because questioning threatens not just the movement, but their entire sense of meaning and identity. Camus warned about this in The Rebel. Once you decide you possess truth, once you convince yourself that your cause justifies any means, you've already lost what made your cause worth fighting for. The rebel must say no to oppression, but also no to becoming the oppressor. The rebel must refuse the logic that sacrificing some for the sake of all is acceptable when you're the one deciding who gets sacrificed. But refusing that logic is nearly impossible when you're inside a movement, when your identity is bound up with its success, when admitting problems means giving ammunition to enemies who will use your honesty against everything you believe. This is the trap. The same loyalty that makes collective action possible makes collective correction almost impossible. The same commitment that gives movements power makes them resistant to recognizing when that power corrupts. Orwell showed us the mechanism. The question is whether understanding the mechanism protects us from it, or just makes us better at rationalizing our own versions of it. Because you can read Animal Farm, nod at its insights, agree that yes, revolutions do tend to betray themselves, and still not recognize when you're living inside one, still not see when you've become the pig justifying the next commandment change, still not understand that your certainty about being different is exactly what every corrupted movement believed about itself. The education in seeing taught Orwell how others deceive themselves. Animal Farm showed how movements deceive themselves, but neither the seeing nor the showing resolved the fundamental problem. That problem lives in the gap between your ideals and your actions, between what you believe about yourself and what you actually do when tested, between the person you think you are and the person you become when power, even small power, even just the power of being right, becomes available to you. And perhaps that's why Orwell made the ending so bleak. The animals look from pig to human, human to pig, and can no longer tell the difference. Not because the distinction doesn't exist, but because the revolution's success was measured by its failure to maintain that distinction. The animals wanted to be free from humans, but freedom turned out to mean becoming human in all the ways that mattered. This isn't counsel for despair, though it feels like it. It's counsel for humility, for suspicion of your own motives, for constant vigilance about the gap between your stated principles and your actual behavior. It's recognition that good intentions don't prevent bad outcomes, that noble causes don't sanctify ignoble means, that fighting monsters requires constant awareness of the monster you might become. The next part of this story is about what that awareness costs, about what happens when you understand not just intellectually, but viscerally, that you contain within yourself the same capacity for corruption you condemn in others, about the moment when resistance becomes so exhausting, when maintaining principles seems so futile, when everyone around you has already surrendered, that loving Big Brother starts to feel not like betrayal, but like relief. like the only honest response to a rigged game you can never win. Winston Smith begins as a rebel. He writes in his diary a capital offense in Oceania. He writes the words, "Down with Big Brother," knowing that writing them means death. He joins what he believes is a resistance movement. He falls in love, which is forbidden, because love creates loyalty to something other than the party. He believes in truth, in memory, in the existence of a reality independent of what the party declares to be real. He is, in the opening chapters of 1984, everything Orwell himself aspired to be after Spain. A man who refuses to surrender his capacity for independent thought. By the novel's final pages, Winston sits in the Chestnut Tree Cafe, drinking Victory gin, staring at a telescreen, broadcasting news of military triumph. He has won the victory over himself. He loves Big Brother. This transformation, from rebel to devotee, from resistance to surrender, is the heart of 1984. Not the surveillance, not the propaganda, not the newspeak, though all those matter. The heart is what happens inside Winston when he finally breaks. Room 101 breaks him. Everyone has a Room 101, some terror so fundamental that when faced with it, they will betray anything, anyone, to make it stop. For Winston, it's rats. When O'Brien, his torturer, brings the cage of rats to his face, Winston screams the only thing that will save him. Do it to Julia, the woman he loves, the person whose existence gave him reason to resist. He offers her to the rats. He doesn't do this reluctantly. In that moment, he wants her to suffer instead of him. He means it completely. This is the moment of actual defeat. Not when they arrested him, not when they tortured him, not when they broke his body or manipulated his thoughts. The defeat comes when he betrays the last thing connecting him to his humanity. After that, loving Big Brother isn't a pretense. It's genuine relief. The war is over. He lost. And losing, it turns out, brings a peace he never found in resistance. Orwell wrote this while dying. Tuberculosis was destroying his lungs. He would collapse while typing, wake up, keep writing. He knew he wouldn't live to see how the book would be received. He was racing his own death to finish warning people about something he could see clearly, something that haunted him since Spain, that totalitarianism doesn't ultimately work through force. Force is expensive, inefficient, requires constant vigilance. Real totalitarianism works by making people want their own oppression, by convincing them that surrender is wisdom, that doubt is exhausting, that the peace of submission is preferable to the agony of resistance. The party doesn't just want obedience, they want love. They want Winston to genuinely believe that 2 + 2 = 5 if the party says so. They want him to look at his own memories and declare them false if they contradict the official record. They want to eliminate the very possibility of internal resistance, the private space where thought occurs independent of power. And they succeed, not by making Winston pretend, but by actually changing what he believes to be true. This is what makes 1984 more than a warning about surveillance or censorship. It's a warning about what happens to the self when maintaining the self becomes too costly. When holding on to your own perception of reality requires constant pain, constant alienation, constant awareness that everyone around you has surrendered and you're alone in your resistance. At some point, the self calculates that it's not worth it, that the price of remaining yourself is higher than the cost of becoming what they want you to be. You've felt this, maybe not in a torture chamber, maybe not facing literal rats, but you felt the exhaustion of being the only person in a room who sees something everyone else refuses to acknowledge. You felt the isolation of holding a truth that makes you unpopular, unwelcome, suspect. You felt the temptation to just accept the consensus narrative, to stop questioning, to let go of the burden of being right. When being right costs you community, belonging, peace. And maybe you've surrendered, not dramatically, not in a moment of torture, but gradually, through accumulated exhaustion. You stopped raising the objection. You stopped pointing out the inconsistency. You started using the language everyone else uses, started accepting the explanations that don't quite explain, started telling yourself that maybe your perception was wrong, maybe you were overthinking, maybe the people who seem so certain have access to understanding you lack. This is how it happens. Not through rats and torture chambers for most of us, but through the steady pressure of wanting to belong, wanting to be part of something, wanting relief from the loneliness of seeing what others won't see. The party understood that human beings need connection more than they need truth, that we will sacrifice almost anything, including our own perception of reality, to avoid the terror of complete isolation. Orwell knew this about himself. He saw how easily he could have become what he opposed. He saw it in Spain when the pressure to conform to party line was enormous, when telling the truth meant being called a traitor by people he'd fought beside. He resisted that pressure, but the resistance cost him. Publishers rejected his work. Friends cut ties with him. He was attacked from all sides, accused of helping fascism by admitting problems on the Republican side. He paid for his intellectual honesty with professional and social isolation. And he must have wondered, in his honest moments, whether it was worth it, whether maintaining his commitment to truth was noble or just stubborn, whether the people who bent, who made accommodations, who learned to live with contradictions, whether they were wrong or just wise in ways he couldn't admit. This doubt, this questioning of whether his own resistance was meaningful or just another form of delusion, that's what makes Winston's surrender so devastating. Because Orwell understood the appeal. The appeal isn't just avoiding pain. It's the genuine peace that comes from stopping the internal war between what you see and what you're supposed to see, what you remember and what you're supposed to remember, what you believe and what you're supposed to believe. When Winston loves Big Brother at the end, he's not pretending. He has actually arrived at a state where his resistance seems like madness and his surrender seems like sanity. The party has won not just his compliance, but his authentic belief. This is the ultimate nightmare. Not a boot stamping on a human face forever, though Orwell gave us that image too. The ultimate nightmare is wanting the boot, loving the boot, believing the boot is your salvation. It's the extinction of the very capacity to imagine freedom, to remember what it felt like to think independently, to hold a thought that contradicts what authority declares to be true. Yet Orwell himself never fully surrendered. Even while dying, even while writing this bleak ending, he kept writing. He kept trying to warn people. He kept maintaining his commitment to intellectual honesty, even when it isolated him, even when it made his life harder, even when cynicism or surrender would have been easier. This is the paradox at the center of 1984. The book shows surrender as inevitable, but writing the book was an act of refusal to surrender. The content says resistance is futile, but the existence of the content is itself resistance. Maybe that's the point. Not that we can win against totalitarianism, not that maintaining truth and decency is guaranteed to succeed, but that the attempt itself is what defines us as human rather than as mechanisms of power. That Winston's surrender is tragic precisely because it shows what we lose when we stop resisting, even when resistance seems pointless. The question, 1984, leaves us with, isn't whether we can prevent totalitarianism. The question is whether we can maintain ourselves against the constant pressure to dissolve into whatever the collective demands we become. Whether we can hold on to our own perceptions when holding on means isolation. Whether we can keep saying 2 + 2 = 4 when everyone around us, people we love and respect, insist that it equals 5. And we're crazy for not seeing it. Orwell couldn't answer that question with hope. He could only show what happens when we fail to answer it, when we choose peace over truth, belonging over perception, comfort over the agony of remaining ourselves against impossible pressure. He showed us Room 101, so we might recognize it when we face our own version, so we might understand what we're surrendering when surrender starts to feel like wisdom rather than defeat. But showing us the mechanism of surrender didn't give him a way to prevent it. And in the end, maybe that was his greatest insight, that awareness doesn't save us. Understanding how we're manipulated doesn't make us immune to manipulation. Seeing clearly doesn't guarantee we'll act on what we see. Sometimes we see perfectly and surrender anyway, because the cost of resistance exceeds what we can bear, because we're human and humans break under sufficient pressure, because loving Big Brother is easier than dying alone in defiance of him. What comes next is the question of what we do with that knowledge. Whether understanding that we all have a Room 101 makes us more compassionate toward those who surrender, or just more cynical about the possibility of resistance. Whether recognizing our own capacity for collapse makes us more vigilant, or just more accepting of the inevitable. Whether Orwell's warning can still function as warning, or whether we're already too deep inside the thing he was warning us about to see our way out. The man who warned against doublethink engaged in it daily. The writer who condemned ideological rigidity maintained rigid positions. The critic of intellectual dishonesty kept a private list of suspected crypto-communists, judging people's loyalty based on their associations, their sexuality, their friends. George Orwell, prophet of totalitarianism's dangers, embodied many of those dangers in miniature. He was his own best case study and his own worst enemy. This isn't hypocrisy in the simple sense. Hypocrisy implies knowing the right thing and choosing the wrong thing anyway. A gap between stated values and actual behavior that you're aware of and cynically maintain. Orwell's contradictions ran deeper. He genuinely believed in common decency while being frequently indecent. He advocated for ordinary people while holding many of them in contempt. He fought against tyranny while displaying tyrannical tendencies in his personal judgments. These weren't failures of character he recognized and ignored. They were blind spots, places where his clarity failed him precisely because he was so convinced of his own clear-sightedness. After his death in 1950, Orwell became perhaps the most misused writer in the English language. Capitalists cite him against socialism, conveniently ignoring that he was a democratic socialist who despised capitalism. Authoritarians of various stripes invoke him against their opponents while embodying exactly what he warned against. Politicians use Orwellian to describe anything they dislike, draining the term of specific meaning. His face appears on posters, his words in advertisements, his ideas twisted to serve causes he would have loathed, and somehow this seems fitting. Not because Orwell would have wanted it, but because it demonstrates his central insight about language and power. Words become weapons. Meanings get inverted. The person warning against manipulation gets manipulated posthumously into supporting positions he explicitly opposed. Even the term Orwellian can be Orwellian, used to obscure rather than illuminate, to serve power rather than challenge it. But here's what makes Orwell's contradictions valuable rather than simply disappointing. He didn't resolve them. He didn't pretend to have achieved some elevated state of consistency where his actions matched his ideals perfectly. He lived inside the tension, struggled with it, sometimes lost to it, kept trying anyway. His failure to be the person his writing suggested he should be doesn't invalidate his insights. It validates them. It proves his central point, that maintaining decency is extraordinarily difficult, that clarity about others' failings doesn't prevent your own, that good intentions provide no protection against becoming what you oppose. Consider the famous list discovered after his death. Orwell had written down names of people he considered unsuitable for anti-communist propaganda work. Some entries are defensible, based on actual political positions. Others are shockingly petty. He questions someone's reliability because they're homosexual. He notes someone else as silly or sentimental. The man who wrote so powerfully against thought police had created his own little catalogue of thought crime, his own miniature ministry of truth, deciding who could be trusted and who couldn't, based on criteria that had nothing to do with their actual political commitments. This should make us uncomfortable. It should make us question everything we've learned from him. But more importantly, it should make us recognize ourselves. Because you've done this too. You've condemned behavior in others while excusing it in yourself. You've held people to standards you don't quite meet. You've judged based on associations, appearances, gut feelings you dressed up as principled positions. The difference between you and Orwell isn't that he was flawed and you're not. The difference is that his flaws are documented and yours are still private. Camus wrote that we all carry within us our places of exile, our crimes, and our ravages. This was his way of saying that recognizing the potential for evil in yourself doesn't make you evil. It makes you human. The person who believes themselves incapable of the corruptions they condemn in others is the most dangerous person of all. They have eliminated the internal check that comes from knowing you could become what you fight against. Orwell's contradictions didn't make him unqualified to warn about totalitarianism. They made him uniquely qualified. He understood from the inside how someone committed to truth could become tyrannical about truth, how someone fighting oppression could become oppressive, how someone dedicated to honesty could engage in subtle, dishonest ties without recognizing them. He didn't understand these things abstractly, from observation alone. He understood them because he felt their pull, struggled against them, sometimes succumbed to them. Animal Farm showed how movements betray their principles. 1984 showed how individuals surrender their capacity for independent thought. But Orwell himself showed something neither book could fully articulate, that the person warning about these patterns isn't exempt from them, that intellectual honesty includes being honest about your own dishonesty, that clarity includes seeing your own blindness, that fighting the good fight doesn't make you good. It just makes you someone trying to fight while carrying all the same human limitations as everyone else. This is what makes his work valuable decades after his death, not because he solved the problem of how to be decent in indecent times. He didn't solve it. He barely survived it. What he did was refuse to pretend the problem was simpler than it is, refuse to offer easy answers that make readers feel better without making them more capable. He showed us the mechanism of our own corruption and trusted us to apply that understanding to ourselves, not just to our enemies. Every political movement in the decades since his death has tried to claim him. The right points to his anti-communism. The left points to his socialism. Libertarians claim his distrust of state power. Authoritarians ignore everything except his warnings about their opponents. Everyone wants Orwell on their side because his cultural authority remains immense. and in their competing claims to his legacy, they prove him right. Language serves power. Truth gets sacrificed to political convenience. The person who tried to maintain intellectual honesty gets conscripted posthumously into serving exactly the kind of ideological dishonesty he spent his life opposing. But maybe that's appropriate too. Maybe the fact that everyone can find something in Orwell to support their position suggests his actual position was more complex than any single ideology can contain. He was a socialist who hated the Soviet Union, an anti-imperialist who understood that simply ending empire didn't solve the problems empire created, a democrat who saw how democracy could slide into its opposite, a believer in truth who recognized that truth was more complicated than any one person's perception of it. He held contradictory positions because reality is contradictory. He embodied tensions rather than resolving them because the tensions can't be resolved, only managed. He failed to be consistent because consistency on these matters requires either lying to yourself about the complexity or simplifying the world to fit your categories. He chose neither option. He chose instead to keep looking at what was actually in front of him, even when what was in front of him contradicted what he wanted to see, even when it revealed uncomfortable things about himself. The final lesson Orwell teaches isn't in his books. It's in the gap between his books and his life. That gap shows us something essential about the human condition and about the particular challenge of trying to be good when goodness seems structurally impossible. The gap shows us that you can see clearly and still act blindly, that you can warn against dangers you're simultaneously succumbing to, that you can dedicate your life to fighting one form of tyranny while exhibiting smaller tyrannies in your own behavior, that you can be right about almost everything and still be wrong in ways that matter. And this isn't counsel for relativism, for declaring that since everyone is flawed, we might as well give up trying to be better. It's counsel for humility, for recognizing that your clarity about others' failings is no guarantee against your own, for understanding that the fight against oppression has to include fighting the oppressor you find when you look honestly at yourself, for accepting that the terrible paradox of being a good person is that goodness is never a state you achieve and maintain. It's a direction you struggle toward while constantly being pulled off course by your own limitations, your own blind spots, your own capacity for exactly the corruptions you claim to oppose. Orwell died young, 46 years old, his lungs destroyed by tuberculosis. He died knowing his two most important books would outlive him, but not knowing how they would be used, how they would be twisted, how Orwellian would become a term deployed by everyone against everyone else until it meant almost nothing. He died without resolving his contradictions, without becoming the person his insights suggested he should be, without finding a way to be decent in indecent times, beyond the simple act of continuing to try despite constant failure. And maybe that's the most honest ending available. Not triumph, not surrender, but the stubborn insistence on continuing, despite overwhelming evidence that continuing won't solve anything. Because the alternative isn't just personal defeat, it's participation in the larger defeat, the collective abandonment of even the attempt at decency, the acceptance that might makes right and power determines truth, and there's no point in resisting the inevitable. Orwell never gave in to that acceptance. Even dying, even contradicting himself, even failing to live up to his own standards, he never stopped trying. He never stopped writing, never stopped warning, never stopped insisting that truth mattered even when he couldn't fully articulate what truth was or how to distinguish it from the lies he told himself. He kept fighting, even though the fight seemed futile. He kept trying to be decent, even though decency seemed impossible. That stubbornness, that refusal to surrender, despite every reasonable justification for surrendering. That might be his real legacy. Not the books, brilliant as they are. Not the warnings, prescient as they prove to be. But the example of continuing to struggle when the struggle appears pointless. Of maintaining principles despite repeatedly betraying them. Of trying to see clearly while acknowledging you're probably blind in ways you can't recognize. Of attempting goodness while knowing you'll fail at it. Because if Orwell, who saw so clearly, who understood so deeply, who warned so eloquently, if he couldn't transcend the contradictions and corruptions he identified, then none of us can. We're all struggling with the same impossible task, trying to be better than our circumstances allow, trying to maintain integrity in systems designed to destroy it, trying to do the right thing when even identifying what the right thing is requires certainty we can never honestly claim. The question his life and work leaves us with isn't how to solve that problem. The question is whether we can live inside it without either surrendering to cynicism or retreating into false certainties. Whether we can keep trying despite knowing we'll fail. Whether we can maintain the struggle not because we believe we'll win, but because the alternative is worse than the struggle itself. That's what comes next. Not a solution, because there isn't one. Not hope, because hope requires believing outcomes will be good. But something harder and more valuable, the willingness to keep going without solution or hope. To maintain decency, not because it will save the world, but because surrendering it means losing what makes you human. To recognize that the terrible paradox of being a good person is that you'll never be good enough, never pure enough, never certain enough, and you have to try anyway, because the alternative is loving Big Brother, and you're not there yet. You woke up this morning already complicit. The phone, the coffee, the electricity, all of it threaded through with harm you didn't choose and can't escape. 7 parts ago, we started here. 7 parts of Orwell's life, his wounds, his warnings, his contradictions. 7 parts of watching a man learn to see clearly and discovering that clarity solves nothing, prevents nothing, saves nothing. And now we're back where we began, with you, awake, complicit, trying. Common decency. That's what Orwell said he went to Spain to fight for. Not ideology, not theory, not some grand blueprint for remaking society. Just the basic principle that ordinary people deserve to live without being crushed. When pressed for why he joined the militia, why he risked his life, that was his answer. Common decency. 2 words that sound almost embarrassingly simple after everything we've explored, after all the complexity and contradiction and failure. But maybe simplicity is what we've been missing. Not simplicity as naivete, not the simplicity that ignores complexity, but simplicity on the other side of complexity. The kind of simplicity you can only reach after going through the full recognition of how impossible everything is, how corrupted every movement becomes, how even the clearest sight doesn't prevent blindness, how trying to be good guarantees you'll fail at being good. After all that, after watching Orwell struggle and contradict himself and die young without resolving anything, we come back to this. Common decency. What does that mean now? Not what did it mean to Orwell in 1936, but what does it mean to you today, reading this, carrying everything you've learned about complicity and clarity and corruption? It can't mean the same thing anymore. You can't go back to innocent notions of goodness, can't pretend the contradictions don't exist, can't unsee what you've seen about how movements betray themselves and individuals surrender and even the prophets embody what they warn against. So decency, if it means anything at all, has to mean something different than it used to mean. not a state you achieve, not a position you occupy, not a team you join, or an ideology you adopt, or a set of principles you follow that prove you're one of the good ones. All of that leads back to the animal farm, back to the pigs walking on two legs, back to loving Big Brother. All of that leads to the certainty that becomes tyranny, the righteousness that justifies atrocity, the clarity that blinds. Decency, the only kind that survives its own scrutiny, must be a verb, an action repeated daily without expectation of success, a direction you struggle toward knowing you'll never fully arrive. Not, I am decent, but I am trying to act decently in this specific moment, with this specific choice, despite knowing I failed yesterday and will probably fail tomorrow. It means waking up already compromised and choosing not to add unnecessary cruelty to the compromise. It means recognizing you're part of systems that harm people and choosing not to personally harm more people when you have the choice not to. It means seeing your own capacity for the corruptions you condemn and choosing to fight those corruptions in yourself before pointing them out in others, or at least fighting them simultaneously, or at least acknowledging they exist in you while you point them out elsewhere. It means holding your certainties lightly. Orwell's great insight was about the danger of false certainty, of ideology replacing reality, of power determining truth. But he struggled with the implications of that insight for his own certainties. If certainty is dangerous, if clarity can become tyranny, if even the commitment to truth can harden into fundamentalism, then how do you believe anything strongly enough to act on it? The answer, which Orwell pointed toward but never fully articulated, is that you hold two contradictory truths at once. You believe what you believe strongly enough to act on it, and you maintain enough doubt about your belief to question it, to listen when challenged, to change when evidence demands change, to recognize that the person arguing against you might be right, or at least might be partly right, or at least might be seeing something you can't see from your position. This is harder than either blind faith or total cynicism. Blind faith gives you certainty without responsibility. Total cynicism gives you superiority without vulnerability. But holding belief and doubt simultaneously, acting on your convictions while questioning them, being committed and uncertain at the same time, that's the exhausting middle ground where decency actually lives. Camus called this living with the absurd, not denying the absurdity, not escaping into false meaning, but recognizing that life is absurd and choosing to live it fully anyway. We must imagine Sisyphus happy, not because pushing the boulder up the mountain is fun or meaningful, or leads anywhere, but because the act of pushing is itself the only available form of rebellion against meaninglessness. The struggle itself becomes the point. Orwell's version of this was common decency in the face of overwhelming evidence that decency fails. He saw how movements betray their principles. He saw how individuals surrender their capacity for independent thought. He saw how even he, knowing all this, still exhibited the same corruptions he warned against. And he kept trying anyway. Not because trying would work, but because not trying meant accepting that power determines truth, that might makes right, that there's no point in resisting the inevitable. The question isn't whether resistance will succeed. History suggests it usually doesn't. The animal farm becomes indistinguishable from the human farm. Winston ends up loving Big Brother. The revolutionaries become the tyrants. Orwell himself contradicts Orwell. The pattern repeats. The system continues. The compromise remains inescapable. The question is whether you can maintain your humanity inside that pattern. Whether you can keep trying to see clearly while acknowledging you're partially blind. Whether you can commit to truth while recognizing truth is more complicated than your perception of it. whether you can fight oppression while watching for the oppressor in yourself, whether you can pursue goodness while accepting you'll never achieve it. This isn't inspiring in the traditional sense. It doesn't promise that good triumphs, or that justice prevails, or that your efforts will be rewarded. It doesn't even promise that maintaining decency makes any difference at all in outcomes. What it promises is that maintaining decency makes a difference in who you are, in whether you remain human or become mechanism, in whether you're a person who thinks and feels and chooses, or just a collection of reactions to stimuli, doing what power incentivizes without question or reflection. Orwell died without seeing how his warnings would be received, how his books would be used and misused, how his own contradictions would become public record. He died without resolving anything, without achieving the consistency he seemed to advocate for, without becoming the person his insights suggested he should be. He died in the middle of the struggle, not at any kind of endpoint or resolution. And that's the most honest thing about him. He didn't pretend to have answers he didn't have. He didn't claim to have transcended the human limitations he identified in everyone else. He showed us the mechanisms of corruption and tyranny and surrender. And then he showed us through his own life that knowing the mechanisms doesn't prevent them from working on you. Understanding the problem doesn't solve the problem. Seeing clearly doesn't make you free. What it does is make you responsible. Once you see, you can't claim ignorance. Once you understand how the system works, you can't pretend you're not part of it. Once you recognize your own capacity for corruption, you can't just condemn others without examining yourself. The education in seeing is also an education in responsibility. You become responsible for what you know, responsible for what you do with that knowledge, responsible for whether you use it to become more human or more mechanical. And here's where we arrive at something that might actually help. Not a solution, not a system, not an ideology, but a practice. The practice of checking yourself against your own standards before checking others against them. The practice of asking what you're adding to the world's suffering before asking what others are adding. The practice of maintaining enough doubt about your own righteousness to listen when someone challenges you. This doesn't mean accepting all challenges as equally valid. Some people are lying. Some movements are corrupt. Some certainties are dangerous. You still have to make judgments, take positions, act on your convictions. But you do it while holding the possibility that you might be wrong, that your perception might be partial, that the person you're arguing with might see something you're missing. You do it while remembering that you contain within yourself the same capacities for self-deception that you identify in others. You do it while acknowledging that the line between fighting tyranny and becoming tyrannical is thinner than you want to believe. You do it while recognizing that your commitment to truth can become its own form of fundamentalism if you're not careful. This is what common decency means after everything. Not innocence, which you lost the moment you started paying attention. Not purity, which was never available and claiming it is dangerous. Not certainty, which leads to the Animal Farm and Room 101. But something harder and more valuable. The willingness to keep trying despite constant failure. To keep seeing despite how seeing hurts. To keep being human despite how much easier it would be to become machine. You'll wake up tomorrow already complicit. The coffee, the phone, the clothes, all of it. Nothing about that changes. But what might change is how you move through the day with that knowledge. Whether you add cruelty when you could choose kindness. Whether you lie when you could tell an inconvenient truth. Whether you silence when you could listen. Whether you close your eyes when you could keep them open despite the pain of seeing. These are small choices, laughably small compared to the enormity of the systems you're embedded in, the historical forces at work, the structural injustices that persist regardless of what you do. Your individual decency won't stop wars or end poverty or prevent tyranny. Orwell knew this. He knew that writing brilliant warnings wouldn't prevent people from ignoring them, that showing the mechanism of corruption wouldn't stop people from being corrupted, that being right wouldn't make him good. He wrote anyway. He tried anyway. He maintained his commitment to common decency, even when decency seemed futile, even when his own behavior contradicted his ideals, even when tuberculosis was destroying his lungs and he knew he wouldn't live to see whether his warnings mattered. He kept going, not because going would succeed, but because stopping meant accepting that the boot wins, that Big Brother wins, that power and lies and manipulation are simply the way things are, and there's no point in resisting. The terrible paradox of being a good person is that you'll never be good enough. You'll compromise when you meant to stand firm. You'll fail to see your own blind spots. You'll become what you opposed if you're not constantly vigilant, and even vigilance doesn't guarantee success. You'll be Orwell, warning against Orwellian tendencies while exhibiting them yourself. You'll be Winston, loving Big Brother, even as you try to resist. You'll be the pigs, walking on two legs, becoming indistinguishable from the humans you overthrew. Unless you understand that the struggle against these outcomes is the point, not victory over them. Unless you recognize that being human means being contradictory, flawed, limited, and that those limitations don't excuse you from trying. Unless you accept that decency isn't something you are, but something you do, imperfectly, repeatedly, without expectation of reward, or even success. Orwell wrote this in his essay, Politics and the English Language, though he could have been describing his entire project. If you simplify your English, you are freed from the worst follies of orthodoxy. You cannot speak any of the necessary dialects, and when you make a stupid remark, its stupidity will be obvious, even to yourself. Apply that beyond language. If you simplify your understanding of yourself, if you're honest about your own corruptions and limitations and blind spots, you become less capable of the worst follies. You can't speak the necessary dialects of ideological certainty. When you make stupid choices, their stupidity becomes obvious even to yourself, which means you can correct them rather than justifying them. This is the practice, not perfection, but honest self-assessment. Not righteousness, but recognition of your capacity for unrighteousness. Not certainty, but commitment despite doubt. Not innocence, but responsibility despite complicity. It's not heroic. It's not inspiring. It doesn't promise transformation or revolution or salvation. What it promises is that you might remain human through inhuman times, might maintain the capacity to think independently through systems designed to make you think in chorus, might keep your decency even when decency costs something and benefits nothing. The moral Orwell left us isn't complicated. Don't let it happen. It depends on you. Not that you can prevent it alone. Not that your individual choices determine outcomes, but that your choices determine whether you participated willingly or maintained whatever resistance you could manage. Whether you added to the machinery of control or threw sand in the gears, even knowing the gears would keep turning. Whether you loved Big Brother or died still refusing to love him. And here, at the end of everything, we find that common decency means exactly what it always meant: treating people like they matter. Telling the truth when lies would be easier. Maintaining your capacity to see, even when seeing makes you uncomfortable. recognizing your own humanity and the humanity of others, even in circumstances designed to make everyone treat everyone else as objects, obstacles, or tools. It means remaining capable of kindness in unkind systems, of honesty in dishonest times, of thought in circumstances that reward thoughtlessness, of decency when decency seems impossible. It means you, tomorrow morning, already complicit, choosing anyway. Not because the choice will save the world, because the choice might save you, because the alternative is surrender, because somewhere between blind faith and total cynicism lives the hardest and most human response. Trying despite everything, seeing despite the pain, remaining decent despite overwhelming evidence that decency fails. Orwell never stopped trying, even dying, even contradicting himself, even embodying the very problems he warned against. He never stopped trying. And if he couldn't transcend it, if he couldn't solve it, if he couldn't be perfectly consistent or purely good, then neither can you. But you can try. And trying, it turns out, is all that decency ever was.